welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Williams, whose work we have been looking at all month out here in the Roundhouse. And Sarah Williams is a painting and drawing instructor at Missouri State University. She's been teaching there for 5 years.
Yep.
She got her MFA from the University of North Texas. That's where we met. And she drove all day to get here. So we're happy to have her here. She's going to talk about her work in a slide presentation, which is being recorded. So we'll have it in our department library, our department archives, right? And it's also being streamed. So Tony, if someone wanted to watch it being streamed live, what would someone have to do?
JSU special events.
JSU special events. So if you have someone who couldn't be here and wants to watch it, you can text them that information. And then, so after Sarah presents her work in here, what we'll do is we'll go out into the gallery outside here for a Q&A, and she might talk a little bit about the work that we've been looking at. So please welcome Sarah Williams with me.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Bryce, for having me. I remember when I was in graduate school, I think you'd been there for a year or something, and I remember you were always kind of like one of my idols because you were so thoughtful and so sincere about your work and had such a good studio practice. So you all are really, really lucky to have him as an instructor. Thank you for everybody at Jacksonville State University. From what I've seen of your campus so far, it's beautiful. So thank you again for having me. Yes, I'm an oil painter. I'm going to show you some of my work today and talk to you about it and some of the concepts behind it. I grew up in a really tiny town in North Missouri, and so my work is about that. And these images, I've never been too pleased with the way that they photograph because they almost look like photographs, and I'm a painter, as you've probably seen the work in the hallway. I think when you see it in person, it looks, I mean, you can see the brush work and a little bit more of my hand on the surface. But that's always one thing I hear a lot in commentary. It's like, oh, these photographs, oh, they're paintings. So that's always kind of fun, just to kind of have that conversation. But growing up in a tiny, tiny town, you don't ever really think about what you're looking at from day to day and how the mundane can become something kind of intriguing and interesting. So these works, I kind of focus on rural settings where people would probably not stop and pay too much attention to the structures or the buildings. So I like to make the mundane seem significant just through the painting process itself. So some of the choices I make, that's what I'm looking for. Everything is nocturnal because that's another way to sort of slow things down. During the day, it would be probably fairly blah, and you wouldn't look at it or pay much attention. But at night, you can kind of like hide things, hide pieces of the building in the darkness, and sometimes the blackness around it becomes sort of a character in and of itself. So they become somewhat narrative. You consider who works there, why do they have it lit like this, what's going on the ground, what evidence is there of humanity in that sort of area or that setting. So that's what I'm sort of trying to investigate. To give you some of my background story, my town I grew up in was like 4,000 people, but we were the metroplex of like the area in North Missouri. We had the only grocery store in like a 30-mile radius, so really, really tiny. I went to an undergraduate program that was also very small. There were only like 1,000 kids on campus, and no one in my family or in my hometown was in the arts. So it was kind of like I knew I loved painting, I loved drawing, and that's what I wanted to pursue. But I didn't really have anybody to ask about it or to interact and like figure out career paths or just even how to apply it. My parents have always been very supportive, which has been a positive thing. But I got into this undergraduate program I actually went because I was on a golf scholarship. I went to undergrad on a golf scholarship and played all 4 years, which I really loved. But it just so happened that they had a great art department too. It was fairly formal. This is the work of Jane Mudd. She was one of my major instructors, and she taught me like everything I know about color and about mark making. We worked only from direct observation in pretty much the entire 4 years that I was there, but it taught me to understand what I was seeing in 3 dimensions, and that way I can kind of better get a sense of space, how to manipulate space on a 2D plane. So it was invaluable time. She's a landscape painter. She does a lot of figurative stuff too, But these are her works, and she would take me out on the weekends, and sometimes after class in the evenings, and we go paint plein air style, and so it was just really nice to have an instructor take an interest in me and kind of help me along. And I learned a lot just from like constant practice. She would always like invite me to go and do like figure painting with her on the weekends at Missouri University in Columbia, so it was great. But very influential in her mark making, color, and I'm so glad that she kind of taught me to be aware of the environment and how to like make choices in what you translate from what you see and how you kind of get it onto your painting surface. So my final year, my senior year of undergrad, I was doing this project where I went to the local Walmart and I had my little easel and I popped it out in the aisles and I painted each little section of the store. And it's so strange, because I look back on this work now and I see a real relationship to what I'm currently doing, and I had no idea why I was doing it at the time. But I guess I've always been interested in kind of like a small town way of life, and you couldn't really go, like if you lived in a city or something, like I spent time in Dallas, and there'd be no way that they would let you do this, if it were in some metropolitan area and there were so many people traveling through that place. But I went on such a regular basis that everybody got to know me. They would set up little like caution cones around my easel legs so nobody would bump me. Parents would figure out when I was there and they'd bring their kids and like have them ask questions and stuff. And so it was just really interacting with the community and getting a sense of, like how things work and people's daily rituals and routines. I'd see the same people at the same time. So it was just kind of interesting. But I've always been interested in kind of like the environment of somebody, the evidence of them without them there. So that was what I was doing my last year of William Woods University, very small. So at that point, I realized that if I didn't go on and pursue my master's, it was probably not too likely that I was going to be able to continue in the art field, just because in rural Missouri in the north, there's not much of an art scene at all. So I made the decision to go ahead and apply to graduate school, and I knew that I probably needed to challenge myself and get a sense of like contemporary art, conceptual art, even like learning how to live in a city, because I never had. I applied just on a whim to the University of North Texas, and I got in. So I showed up to, I think, drawing class on the first day, and I remember we met with, it was Matt Bourbon, and he was like, okay, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks, bye. And I was like, what do I do? There's no assignment, how do I do this? So I had no idea what I wanted to paint about or what I was interested in. I started doing these still lives, because I knew I just loved color, I loved paint, I loved looking at things. And then I was kind of like exploring things about light, about just mundane subject matter. And the critiques were horrible. I was like, this is terrible, this is never gonna work, I'm gonna flunk out of graduate school. And I realized it was kind of empty. Like, it didn't really mean anything to me. I liked the process, I liked the color, but it wasn't important. And so I started kind of looking around and looking at arcs. I didn't know what I was doing. I got introduced to a lot of like contemporary works. They had wonderful museums and galleries in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so I got to experience that. Of course, like getting around in that sort of area was a nightmare for me at first. I think it was like white-knuckled everything for like the first 2 years I lived there. And it was crazy to even think about. Bryce, I was talking to you about this earlier. Just the campus alone at the University of North Texas was exponentially larger than my hometown's population. It just like blew me away. I could hardly handle it. But it was so good for me, just like to challenge myself. So I was looking at all this art, going to museums, trying to figure out what was important to me. And I noticed that I was gravitating towards installation work. And I thought, well, does this mean I need to be a sculptor? And I realized that it was more about this work. Tara Donovan, she uses really mundane, lowbrow kind of material and makes it significant, just from like the numbers in which she displays this stuff and how she puts it together and how she transforms it to something else. I was also looking at Sarah Z quite a bit, and that was like the light. I've always loved light, like diffuse light, color, space, how she set things up. So I really highly recommend looking at their work if you're unfamiliar. So I started to kind of like think about why I related this and how I related to this. And I was looking at so much work, I just like narrowly avoided paralysis by analysis. It's just like thinking about it too hard. But I realized, after so many bad critiques, I just did this on a whim. I had this image, a snapshot of something from my hometown, and I just wanted to paint it because I just wanted to paint something that made me feel good. And I couldn't articulate at the time. I was just so homesick. And so I was like 10 hours away from my family. I was only going home like twice a year because it was such a long drive and everything was so busy. I did this just to make myself feel better. And I almost didn't take it to critique, but it got such like conversation going. You know, it was like talking about the concept and why I'd done it. And I realized that there was something there. So I started to kind of like dig and think about it. And it took me moving to Dallas, Texas, Denton, Texas, to realize that I had something to say about Brookfield, Missouri, and to paint about rural Missouri. So I'm really glad I made the move, you know, and was able to realize that that's my story and what I need to paint about. So Brookfield, very small, tiny little population. It's an agrarian society, so this is the kind of stuff that I grew up with. You know, everybody is either a farmer, cattle farmer, crops. My mom has got a farm and she's grown beans and corn, you know, all of the time I was growing up, and we still have it. So having that kind of background, I realized that I have some insight that probably most people don't have, and I realized that just in conversation with people that lived in the city. You know, like I was able to like make these observations that I just thought everybody knew. You know, I was like, whoa, I'm a little bit different. You know, I have something different, a different perspective. So let me see if I can paint about it. But, you know, like Farmer's Almanac, people are always like, when you check out at the grocery store in Brookfield, they're just like, oh, have you seen the woolly worms this year? That means it's going to be a tough winter. Do you guys make predictions like that? It's like if they're all black, it's going to be really cold and really wet and stuff like that, you know. So it's like this extra awareness of the atmosphere and the weather and kind of the light. So that's kind of what I grew up thinking about and being aware of and looking at. When I was a kid, I remember my dad would take us to Kansas City, which was about 2.5 hours away, was the closest city. And we would go to the museum, the art museum, because they knew I had an interest. And these were like my art heroes. Again, it was something I didn't realize until I got a little perspective, moved to the city. These are the regionalist painters. So Thomas Hart Benton, he was a Kansas City boy, and he was painting about the rural Midwest. And kind of like making a stand and saying, you don't have to live in New York, you don't have to live in a city to be an artist. So I found that really empowering. Also, Grant Wood, you know, he's from Iowa. So just the idea that you can have pride about your hometown and like farm culture and things like that, it made me feel like I had something to be proud of and something to paint about. So it was like backing me up in a way. Obviously, Hopper, Edward Hopper, and a lot of times my work is spoken about in terms of like Edward Hopper, similar because you do see a lot of structures and there's this like melancholy quality. I think that my work's different because it doesn't feel melancholy to me. Maybe it's just because I have that home pride that I'm painting about and it looks different and I think about it different. But I feel like his are always, there's like melancholy. Mine's almost like, I feel like pride sort of thing, even though they're nocturnal and it sometimes appears somewhat creepy. I think it depends on who you are and how you relate to it, whether it feels creepy or not. And that's something that's fun, you know, like when I can take it to a different region or have a show somewhere else and have conversations with people in the audience. I love hearing how they relate to it because, again, something that gives me perspective. You know, if I'm talking to somebody that grew up in Houston, Texas or in LA, it's like they see it completely different than I do. And some of the conversations can give me a way to think about it and to play with things that I hadn't thought of before. But there's like 3 main responses I've found. Like people say, oh, this is like where I grew up, I relate to this, it makes me feel good. The second one is, you know, if it's somebody that's lived in a metropolitan area and they've done some road trips, they look for these little places late at night when they need gas or they need to stop for a bathroom break or something. So they're like little beacons in the night. And then every once in a while, this is not as common, but people will say, oh man, this really creeps me out. This makes me uncomfortable. And the first time I heard that, I was like, what are you talking about? This is like where I'd want to be. And I think it's the idea, like if you've always lived in the city, the idea of like a black horizon is kind of creepy. There's no lights, there's no humanity. It's just that one little thing, and then it stretches out into like nothingness or perceived nothingness. I would much rather be here than in Dallas at night, to tell you the truth. So I started, as I was in Texas, really getting into these nocturnal scenes, and I would go home twice a year, you know, like in the summer and also around winter break, and I load up on resource material because I was removed from the place. I'd always painted from direct observation, and those very first still life paintings I was doing from observation in my studio. I'd build these big, like massive almost installations of sculpture, and I'd paint it, light it and paint it. But I only had snapshots to work from. And Bryce, you've probably seen in my studio when we did like studio visits, they're terrible. They're tiny, they like print them out at Walmart, you know, and they're those 4x6 things. And I've got this old point and shoot that's like a digital camera I got when I was in college, when I went to as a freshman. I'm still using that thing. It's so terrible, it's horrible. I love it. Because I want the image to be so bad and so poor that it doesn't give me all the information and I have to invent quite a bit of it. So I was working from these snapshots in my studio, removed from it, and I was thinking about my home and what I thought about. And I noticed that, like, when I began these, and these are some of the earlier pieces, not like at the very beginning, but early, I was thinking about Brookfield and the northern Missouri as more of like a whole. So everything was sort of industrial. I'd paint a lot of like silos, grain bins, car washes, because that's a lot of what you see, little factory buildings and things. And I tried different approaches, you know, just to kind of express what I was interested in. I really liked the palette and kind of the drama, the cinematic quality that nighttime lends to those really run down buildings. But I thought, well, maybe I could try some daytime things, you know, and I'm interested in showing the humanity that's there through the structures and the evidence of them, like tire tracks on the ground, either through snow or through like wet pavement. So I thought, well, maybe I should try some things at daytime. So something that was also kind of unique to the Midwest is the weather, the snow. So like I was talking about earlier, that sense of like agrarian, what's the weather doing? What is the season? What's the cycle? I started bringing that into my studio too. And I feel like these day scenes, they don't quite accomplish what I want, and just like the impact of the image, and then like kind of what it doles out the more time you spend with it. So they were a good exercise. With this one, I remember I also presented something like this in grad school where, you guys hunters? Any of you hunters? No? Okay. So, you know, like deer season, every November when deer season rolls around in my town, like driving to school in the morning, you would see everybody's kill, you know, it'd be hanging from their front tree or from like their kids' swing set and, you know, just out in the yard. And that's normal, you know, and then I showed this in grad school and everybody's like, what is this? Do people do this? So I had to explain the whole process, you know, and it's just, again, something that's very unique to where I grew up. So I had something to say about it. Very common. So yeah, it gave me the opportunity to kind of try something different, to kind of show tire tracks in the ground, play with shadows, play with light. And then I started thinking about interiors, and I did a little series of that. And I was also kind of aware, like kind of like what I did in undergrad, where I was going to the local Walmart and painting each of the little aisles. But there are certain or buildings, kind of businesses in Brookfield that we frequented a lot as like my family growing up. And this is the little butcher shop, like 2 blocks from my parents' house. And so I went down there and asked if I could take some photographs, like with the lights off and stuff. And generally, like if you went to a grocery store and say, can I turn off your lights? They would say no, and we're calling the police. But like they wanted to support me, you know, and that's the cool thing. Like my whole town supports what I'm doing, and they like bend over backwards to kind of help me out and whatever they can do, which is sort of neat. So they even rolled out sides of beef for me, you know, so that's also nice. Again, not something you probably could get done in a big grocery store. But I was trying to kind of investigate someone's like livelihood, you know, and this building, it's been owned by the same family for generations, and it's kind of this hodgepodge. So they put together all these weird pulley systems, and it's really unique, and you probably would never find something like this ever again. And that's why I like it. It's unique. It shows how they live and work there in that space. As I was living in Texas, I became more and more aware, the more years I was away from Brookfield, the differences, you know, like, again, kind of furthering that perspective and how I can understand and see my hometown. And as I was away longer, when I'd go home, I'd realize like the stars were so clear, and it was because there was no light pollution, because it was such a small place. So I started making this little series about the stars and sort of the constellations as they move throughout the seasons. And that's something, again, that farmers are really aware of. They know what season it is, and they know where the constellations are in the sky depending on that time of year. So I was sort of playing with that as well. and sense of time, passage of time. So these works, you know, I was managing my homesickness while I was making these away from my town, and I didn't even realize this until I moved back to Missouri for the job that I'm working in now. And I was like, oh, that's what it's about. I needed that subject matter, you know? And so I would take these tiny little snapshots and work from them in my studio. And I was thinking about like the history and the memory of that place and how it was shown in the structure itself. So that was really interesting to me, and kind of playing with like obstructed views. This one I thought I was playing with like sort of silhouetted objects in the front to kind of add a little bit more question to like where this place is, what it is, what you would do, like what the viewer's role is. A lot of times I would shine like my car lights on subject matter, you know, to kind of light it. And then it also makes the sense of space bigger than where the picture plane ends, because it puts you there in that place. So it's like, are you in the car? Do you have a flashlight in your hand? Like, what is your role as a viewer? So I'd be driving around and I was looking at all these like unique things, just finding unusual sort of signs and towns and kind of exploring that. I got onto another little series where, again, I was thinking of passage of time and like the history of the place, and I started slowly getting into the pattern of pavement on the ground. So like when you drive through parking lots, you can kind of get a sense of how old something is by how broken up it is. So they became almost, after a while, like the main component of this landscape, like the painting that I was doing, and they became almost like entirely abstract. Like these, just like the tire tracks indicate someone's passage through there, and like the car lights. But here, you know, I'm taking out subject matter, like no structures at all, but that broken up kind of pattern on the ground. So I really became invested in that, and they were for me just kind of like abstract paintings, and that's something I was never very successful with. Another reason I really admire Bryce's work, you know, because it is so beautifully abstracted and the colors are amazing. So that was another little thing I was experimenting with. I think, you know, if you're an artist, you're either a hedgehog or a fox. And I think we were having this conversation in grad school one time. And if you're a fox, you're moving around with your concepts and your materials and your approach, like you're all over the map. But if you're a hedgehog, you steadily work away at something and you see change, but it's very slow. So I'm a hedgehog. I'm moving through different ideas, and I look back on my body of work, I can kind of see like what my interests were and how I played off of each one. But yeah, I like to kind of move my way through it slowly. And this is when I was getting closer to moving back to Missouri. I took that job in 2012 at Missouri State University, and honestly, I never really thought I'd be back in the Midwest. Bryce and I were talking about this earlier. I think when you get out of grad school and you're doing the adjunct thing, you hope for a job anywhere. And so you like blanket the entire United States and hope that you get an interview. I had no idea I'd be back in Missouri. It's kind of neat coming back. Again, kind of the perspective that I gain. So now I'm driving home from the university and I'm going through neighborhoods to get there. And so I'm thinking more specifically about people, like the individual. When I was in Texas, I was thinking as a whole and thinking about the industry and the business that was there and how it was different than like the metropolitan area. Another thing that kind of like got me when I was down in Texas is I lost my sense of landmarks. And I've always been one of those people to give directions like drive to the pink house, take a left, keep going until you see the mailbox that looks like a bass kind of thing. So, but in Texas, like if one McDonald's looks the exact same as the McDonald's like 3 blocks away, and I couldn't get anywhere because I kept forgetting like where that specific McDonald's was, because it was like the cookie cutter prefab sort of thing. So that was another thing that I was aware of and kind of playing with. But these houses, when I moved back to Missouri, I started thinking about these houses and people's own little homes, especially at Christmas time, because the decorations, they really show someone's personality. They become someone's like surrogate. The outside of their house is almost like the surrogate of who lives there. So I started making a series about them, and all the while thinking about what they would look like in a row. So it's like a little neighborhood when they're displayed kind of down the wall at a gallery or something. It's like it sends a sense of a street, you know, like going down the neighborhood. and you never know what you might find. People go all out, like Clark Griswold style at Christmas Vacation. And it's crazy because like there was this house I came across and it had a whole bunch of lights everywhere, strung on trees all over the house. In the front, they had like a nativity scene with those glowing figures. And then right in the middle of the nativity scene, they had a big blow up Santa, you know. And another house I saw, are you guys aware of those like reindeer that light up and they put together? Yeah. Someone had hung one upside down from a clothesline, you know, like it was a deer being field dressed, and they had like red lights coming out the bottom. It's like, wow, that's unique. Okay. So just my part of the world, but you just never know how you're going to interpret something. And then it kind of morphed into almost a strange voyeuristic kind of study. So I became aware as I would walk down the streets, you know, or drive down the streets, that everyone had these enormous glowing TVs through their front windows, and they'd have their curtains wide open. It's like you go down the street and you could watch TV with every family as you go, and these enormous TVs. So it was kind of this a sense of like these enormous artificial glowing lights, and you just sometimes get a peek of them from underneath windows or curtains and things. So that became another thing I was interested in painting about. Again, like when these are displayed in a row down a wall, it looks like a little neighborhood. I love color, as you can tell. And when we go out and look at the work, I can talk to you a little bit about color theory. But that's something that I was really interested in from the very beginning. I think that's why I was making those still lives, just because I love pushing color around. More recently, I've been thinking about kind of the events that happen in a small town, you know, like festivals and fairs. There's a big food truck movement, you know, like whenever I do get to visit a city, it seems like all the big rage is like food trucks and the kind of what food they're offering. Little towns have them too, you know, it's like corn dogs and funnel cakes and things like that, or ticket booths. So I'm interested in kind of like temporary structures, you know, 4th of July, there's always those things that pop up in grocery store parking lots, and they have tents, and sometimes they roll down their flaps, and it's just kind of aesthetically interesting. So I'm always interested in getting the viewer like a hook, a visual hook from across the room. And then I want you to come and stand in front of my painting and spend time with it. So if I can do that, I'll give you something for each like step closer you get. I'll talk to you outside about color theory, and I mix my own blacks, like pigments. Everything is optical black. I don't own black. And in my painting classes, I'm kind of a stickler for that. I'm like, do not have black on your palette. It just kills your chroma. But when you mix your own and you make your own, you can control space. So you guys know that warm colors advance and cool colors recede. So it helps me kind of like hide structures or pieces of the structure, and then you'll see it. If you invest some time and you stand in front of my painting, it will just kind of pop out to you sometimes. You'll be like, oh, there's a piece that I didn't realize was there. It's kind of a little secret. So I like to try and give away the information slowly for people who invest some time looking at it. This is something Springfield, Missouri is known for, apparently, pineapple whip. And there's a couple of them, these little trailers floating around town, and the little girl on top, her hips go back and forth. But it's like everybody, when they see this in Missouri, they're just like, oh, pineapple whip. And you say it like that. It's like whip. But they all know that little structure. So I'm trying to continue my ability to get perspective on my understanding of the Midwest. So in the summers, I've been really trying to do artist residency programs. And it's a competitive thing. It's almost like a grant. You make applications. They're all over the country and all over the world. So they provide room and studio and room and board and time to work on your own paintings or your own research. So the last several years, I've been to Wyoming. I've been to rural Washington State. This summer, I was at the Millet Colony up in New York in a rural part. So I'm kind of like trying to work my way across the country. And when I'm there, these things tend to be about a month in duration. So it allows me kind of like a home base, and I can explore out from that area and investigate another region of the country, like their rural towns, like the structures, what the way of life is like, take resource imagery and kind of explore that too, and get a sense of like how it compares to what I know about the Midwest. But a lot of times the studio space is so gorgeous. This was my studio at Willapa Bay in Washington, and that residency was on this little, almost like an island in the middle of nowhere. And there was like a 20-minute walk to the bay on one side, and then it was like a 30 or 40-minute walk to the ocean on the other side. And there was like no one around, and it was so great. It was such a good summer. And dinner was on the table at like 6:30, and they'd bring lunch to you in a little picnic basket at like noon. It was like artist paradise. It was so great. And so it makes you have major studio envy, like when you go back to your own studio. But this was the space I was working in. I could work every day, all day long for the entire month. It was great. I'm also kind of doing some little car plein air paintings again, because painting from life and kind of keeping up with that looseness and kind of figuring out how to translate what I'm seeing in real life and about the light onto a flat surface. So I built this little like thing that I put on my steering wheel, and those little squares are about like 6 or 8 inches square. And I'm driving around at like dusk, and I give myself like 20 or 30 minutes tops. You know, like the sun has to be down by about like 10, 20 minutes. And so there's still atmospheric light, but you get that nice kind of glow and everything's dark. And I try to illuminate things with my headlights and really practice like how I see things. And I'm just doing it as an exercise for another sort of application of my understanding of night and light and colors. So I'm constantly trying to push my understanding of everything. Here's some images of things that I've found at these residencies. This one was in Astoria, Oregon. And it was really kind of an unusual town. It had a lot of weird elevation change that I didn't expect, but kind of like a little cupcake shop or something that I had found. Kind of unusual houses. The architecture is a lot different again than what I'm aware of and kind of used to. So it's just a neat way to explore more surroundings, more of my area. And just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm working, because some of you, if you're like seniors, you're probably still thinking about your next step. I currently have got my studio in one of the bedrooms of my home. It's not ideal, but it's a space that I work in. And I feel like your practice, your studio practice, and holding yourself accountable, like making sure you get in there and spend the time and the work on a regular basis, is super important for me. So like my ritual of when I paint, how often I paint, I try and stick to it no matter how busy I get and how crazy things are. It's small, but you find a way to make it work. And that is my presentation. Thank you again for coming.